I'm drawing our alleyway, the one behind our studio. It doesn't seem like much to very many people, but every time I drive back there, I see so many interesting things. I always want to just sit and draw telephone poles, fences, the backs of houses, because for whatever reason, that stuff just looks so cool to me. I don't know. But anyway, here we are drawing it on a pad now. Finally, I get my opportunity. And I'm using a micron pen to start the drawing off. I'm building up an outline of sorts around all the major shapes that I'll be filling in with grayscale markers. I'm using a little bit of perspective and a lot of overlap. The overlap is in substitution of linear perspective, which is what the two lines above and below all of what will be telephone poles to the right side of the alleyway are sitting up against. Those two lines are implying to me how the volumes are receding into space without having a horizon line out there and a vanishing point to work with. The micron pen establishes also smaller shapes for me that I won't be shading later on, but actually when the grayscales go in around them, they will imply smaller shapes out in the picture field. A pencil would work just as well. I just didn't use one. Oh great, look, a truck. What the heck? I can't believe this. A truck parks right out in front of me. And in actuality, this drawing took around 25 minutes, and the truck parked out there for about 18 of those 25 minutes. Stupid truck. Anyway, here we are working with the markers in a technical fashion. It's going very fast, but I'm laying all the brush strokes right next to each other, one next to the other. That's the technical way of doing things, and you block things out much faster if you do it that way, and it doesn't destroy the pen tip. Then I flip the pen over and use the smaller point to establish the details around the silhouette, and that gives scale to the size of this tree rather than those bigger, bolder brush strokes being the scale. Then from that, I start to work on the objects right behind the tree, and they have a similar value to the tree in the foreground in the darkest areas, but I'm using a slightly lighter value pen, the trees being a 90% and this is a 70% marker, to put the darker things behind the even darker thing in front of them, because I don't want their values to blend in. And so much so that I'm using a darker marker here to push this forward silhouette, and then a Sharpie to break the silhouettes apart from each other. And that's far enough apart now where I can definitely see when I look at the picture in front of me instead of in a scan or in a photograph, I can tell what is what because the silhouettes have some kind of breakup between them. This cool grayscale marker now is what I'm using to build the tree branches and the trunks. The difference in temperature is like a difference in value, only it shares a similar value to the other values in the picture, but the difference in the temperature sets the objects apart far enough that you see things very differently from one another. Much like when you paint a picture, you have warm lights, cool shadows, cool lights, warm shadows. Here I'm using warms and cools to break up space a little bit more. It just gives me more value variation to work with in the end. And don't mistake the word value for darker and lighter. It just, in this case, I'm using it in relationship to the temperature. Value equals light and dark, and temperature is helping me get 10 more values of light and dark to work with. This lighter marker, I'm blocking out all of the light buildings, the things that are painted white. The trees in the background actually aren't that light, but I'm pushing it for atmosphere so it has more depth of field in the picture. And what I come to find later on is that I don't really need to push it that far because that alleyway is a lot flatter, being really close in space. And by darkening things down a little bit, it gives me more variation and more volume within all the objects back there. Now the silhouettes I'm building I have to be really careful about because the markers bleed, and if they bleed too much I lose those tree branches, so I'm still exaggerating their width a little bit, knowing that the bleed is going to push in and shrink them a little. And here's that second pass using the grayer the same markers but darkening things down. And this one I'm actually using one of the darker markers to push these objects back in space, but also overlap the other objects because I realized that in that middle ground things aren't overlapping well enough. Smaller objects in the picture can have a darker treatment to them as long as their volumes don't exceed a certain scale. And that's those little blips that you see out in the alleyway. And while you can't see any of this being sketched over here, what I'm doing is blocking in the building and a couple cars over here, but they're just the beginnings of the silhouette. I still have to go in and darken things further. These trees are casting their own shadows just upon themselves. Since it is a foggy day or an overcast day, you're not getting really any direct light that's causing stronger shadows. But there is a difference in transition of value from the top to the bottom of all those branches, and I'm trying to link those or join those values together. Here's a third pass over all those light gray objects, and it's giving everything back there even more volume where I just don't have enough markers, and that's why I'm extending them as such. And in this tree I just don't have the range of values, so I'm really relying upon the pens and the repetition of layers to help darken things down before I actually have to reach for one of the darker pens that I'm using for these objects, the buildings and the tops of the trees, to explain their volume in a darker value. I'm trying to keep the confusion as minimal as possible, and all the decisions that I'm making are based upon the few pens that I have and what I can do with them. I either have a darker or a lighter object. I either put detail in or no detail. I either put something there or I don't put something there. And once I've made that decision, with marker especially, I can't go back. So here I'm really playing with a lot of middle values that are dangerously close together, and it's breaking the depth of field a little bit. So I move on to other areas and let my mind think about it a little bit while I'm working on other stuff. If I'm succeeding in other areas, it'll help me succeed in this area when I come back to it, rather than beat my head trying to figure out what it is that's going wrong. I'll use the micron pen every now and again to bring up little tiny details, and as long as those lines stay thin, I don't have to worry about them competing with anything else in the picture space and or becoming outlines unto themselves. And as a result, the scale works really nicely within the value range. I can use a pencil too, but I just chose to use markers all the way through on this. These cars need a little more description for me to fill the values in and get the shapes correct. And the nice thing is the value that I use in the markers will match the outlines, and you won't see the outlines anymore once I fill all the shapes in. But that really helped me break up the space, harmonize the shapes, keep the perspective right without having to guess using the actual paint, or in this case the marker acting as the paint. The fourth pass over all these objects, and it's allowing me to set more detail into everything, but it's also flattening the space. As I was mentioning before, this alleyway is a lot more compressed from front to back. It doesn't have that much atmosphere, and yet I am pushing a little bit of atmosphere because the picture needs it, but I'm trying to also be true to the objects. And here I am using the darker value, finally getting to it. I realize I have to use it, especially in front of that light wall, or else that wall won't step back into space. The left side needs a little bit more of a finish, and then I realize I need an outline around this thing, so I'm going to go ahead and go with a dark marker and place an outline around it, framing it, and that'll give me context clues to finishing this. The foreground needed a little bit more work, but I wasn't sure how far to take it in the frame. Helped me figure that out. It also helped me figure out what value to push so it steps forward instead of back. Alright, I'm out of here. Gotta go!